Thank you, Dr. Harper, for that very informative presentation. So next, our first panel on policy is moderated by Rich Buery. I apologize if I butchered your last name. A New York native, urbanist, social innovator, educator, and CEO of Robin Hood Foundation, who has been a leading force since he was 17 and founded a summer program for kids in the Massachusetts housing development. He has dedicated his career to advancing equal opportunities for families and communities and has extensive experience across the New York City government, education, and nonprofit landscape. Rich, you're getting us started with a highly debated topic.
Good morning. Thank you so much. Good morning. Sure, of course.
Sorry, if you're looking for a seat, there's seats up front. If you'd like to hustle your bustle before Rich gets started, you can grab one up here. Otherwise, make yourselves comfortable wherever you are.
Hustle your, I never heard that before. Hustle your bustle, all right.
My grandma taught me.
Good morning, everybody. First of all, I want to thank Dan, my longtime friend and former colleague, for bringing us here today. And also, Dr. Hopper, thank you for those really remarkable comments, both the historical context, national context, and Deputy Mayor William Isom, just for really bringing us a message of hope, which I think is important in this moment. I called, I reached out to Ann the other day, I think it was like 7 o'clock at night, and I was like, you know, I just want to, can we talk for a minute, I had some questions, but, you know, I know it's late, don't want to bother you. She's like, late? It's 7 o'clock. You take them off the clock at 7 o'clock. So I know she talked about working late till you're exhausted, and I know that you and your team are working incredibly hard in this difficult moment. So just want to thank you for your leadership. Yeah. So, you know, as we heard from the deputy mayor earlier, you know, the influx of migrants into New York City has really created an unprecedented challenge for our city. And it's a challenge that I know has led many to question whether New York City's right to shelter really makes sense in the way it was conceived in this moment. And I think most of us would agree that no one anticipated the particular moment that we are in right now. Yet as the city works to manage the shelter population, we are also seeing the human toll that it's placing on migrants and the organization that supports them, especially during these winter months. And as Deputy Mayor William Isom said, we also know that the migrant crisis presents an opportunity to embrace this next wave of newcomers who, like generations before them, like my parents, like the parents of many of those in this room, play such a vital role in making this city what it is, to make the American, you know, as you said, to make the American dream big enough for everyone, including big enough for these new round of Americans. So this is obviously a very complicated topic. It doesn't have a lot of simple solutions, but we're incredibly grateful to have this group of folks to help us work through it. It's hard to imagine a group of people who have better depth of expertise and knowledge and experience and moral leadership as we help wrestle through these questions. So I'm not going to read their bios because they're all in the list, all in the materials, but I want to thank Josh Goldfein, Linda Gibbs, Molly Park, and Achilles Kallergis for being here today. And I want to start with you, Commissioner Park. Obviously, you've got probably the hardest job in the country right now. But I want to start with the concept of innovation, which came up earlier. And I hadn't quite internalized this number, but Ann talked about how the capacity has tripled over the last 22 months. And so I want to start maybe a two-part question. What flexibility, do you have the flexibility you need? Does Callahan afford you the flexibility you need to respond in an innovative way to a crisis like this? And I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. And then also, how does the city's affordable housing goals, how does that interact with the current crisis?
Great, thanks so much. Thank you to HELP for having me. Really happy to be here. I am certainly making a lot of lawyers unhappy by being a part of this panel, but I think it's a really important conversation, and if you hear anybody choking, you know it's because I went off script. So let me start by taking a step back and just talking about who we are at DHS, right? Our mission is to prevent homelessness wherever possible, to address street homelessness, and really importantly, fundamentally, to provide safe, temporary shelter, and then ultimately connect New Yorkers experiencing homelessness to permanent housing. Sheltering and assisting individuals who are experiencing homelessness, no matter why that homelessness came about, is the core of what we do. We heard some discussion earlier about the West Coast. I grew up on the West Coast. I go, out there every year, and it's staggering. It's some of the most expensive real estate in the world, and it can look like, any developing country. In New York City, 95% of the people experiencing homelessness are in shelter, and we want to do better than that. We don't want to retreat from it, right? So we are committed to what we are doing. Shelter is what we are here to provide shelter and to keep people safe. That being said, none of the rules and the environment that we are in right now was designed with the status quo in mind. Somebody else said this is a system, we operate a system that evolved over a 40-year period in a whole lot of different ways, and it's more than doubled in 2 years. We are having conversations about Callahan. We are talking about the rules and environment that we live in. But we're talking about temporary modifications. So we're not looking to end our obligation to provide temporary housing. I couldn't sit here as the commissioner and do that. That is not who I am. It's not who the agency is. It is not who the city is. But we are, I think, looking for different ways that we can adapt the models that we provide services. The one constant over the last couple of years has been the pace of change. The number of people coming in has fluctuated wildly. The deputy mayor, cited that right now we're at 1,500 people a week, but there have been weeks where it's been more like 6,000, 7,000 people a week. We've gone back and forth between serving largely families and serving largely singles. The nationalities of who's coming in has changed wildly. It's the federal policy environment has changed on a sometimes overnight basis. I think very much driven by what the Adams administration has done, right? For example, we now have TPS protections for a number of Venezuelan asylum seekers. That wasn't the case. Every time we have these external factors are changing, we need to adapt. We need to be able to try new things. At the start of this crisis, we were treating it as a straight up homelessness issue. Department of Homeless Services was the lead agency for the first, 8-9 months. And that grew to really become a whole of government effort, in part just because it was too big for the Department of Homeless Services, right? We have, at this point, 55,000 non-asylum clients that we need to make sure that we are providing high-quality services to, as well as the asylum seekers. So we needed more resources, more bodies, more brains to provide shelter, but really also because we're coming to the realization that what we're dealing with right now is fundamentally an immigration issue. Yes, we're talking about low-income households who need a stable place to stay, but the other kinds of issues that people are facing are very, very different. I am going to grossly oversimplify the amazing work that social workers and caseworkers do for the sake of conversation, right? But for our more traditional clients experiencing homelessness, right, there is a checklist that starts with, let's get you onto the benefits for which you're eligible, let's figure out what the appropriate housing subsidy is, if there are underlying issues that help trigger your experience of homelessness, let's make sure that we are getting referrals to community services, and let's and then let's look for a permanent housing placement, right? That checklist, various nuances around that checklist, works very well, and our amazing providers are able to replicate that over the system writ large. That checklist doesn't apply to the asylum seekers, right? That checklist looks entirely different, right? It is about what legal services do you need? Have you applied for asylum? Have you applied for TPS? Have you applied for work authorization? So we do need different kinds of approaches, right? It's about the pace of change, it's about the volume, it's about the needs of the clients. You know, and I will say, you know, it's not to say that homelessness as we know it and with our traditional clients stays static. There were some references to this earlier, right? We have certainly seen growing income inequality over the last 40 years. We've seen loss of affordable housing. You know, fentanyl in the drug supply has had enormous change on needs of clients. In the grand scheme of things, relative to what we're seeing with asylum seekers, those are marginal and relatively slow changes that we can manage. When we have had a true shock to the system, and I think COVID is the best analogy that I can come up with, we've had to completely change how we do services. And I think we didn't need to go into court there because we were all approaching this as, you know, it was general widespread assessment that this was an emergency and we needed to do things differently. In a lot of ways, what we're seeing now is as big, if not bigger, a shock to our homeless services system as COVID, and therefore I do think it is appropriate to think about different ways of operating services. But I said it at the beginning, I'm going to say it again, providing safe and strong shelter services is really core to what we do, and we are not stepping back from that. Do you want me to jump right into affordable housing?
Sure, yeah, please.
Okay. You know, for those of you who know me, I'm a houser by training. Permanent housing is the goal for everybody, and that's true whether we're talking about our more traditional homeless clients or those seeking asylum. You know, and I think this question of right to shelter versus right to housing is a really interesting one that could be a day's conference all on its own. But one of the things that I would say, and I know Josh, you're going to talk about it more as well, but the downsides of right to shelter that we heard about earlier, right? It's messy, it's also expensive, it is hugely politically unpopular when you're citing a shelter in somebody's neighborhood, actually gives a fair amount of latitude for the agency to innovate on permanent housing. So we have traditionally, over the last few years, have been doing about 200 permanent subsidized, and I emphasize subsidized because those are the ones that really stick, housing placements a week. I think we're up to closer to 250 on average these days, and we're going to continue to move the needle. And we, as an agency, have been able to really innovate in the housing space a bit. So City FEPS, our city-funded rental voucher, can now be used anywhere in New York State. That's something we're really excited about. And then we have a contract, the Affordable Housing Services Contract, more colloquially known as the Master Lease, for those of you who've been working with it. This has been something that has been around for a while to allow not-for-profits to lease permanent housing for clients in the shelter system. We've now converted that to a 30-year project-based subsidy contract so that not-for-profits can actually acquire housing that can be long-term housing for clients coming out of the shelter system. I think the ability to innovate like that is actually really fundamentally driven by the right to shelter because of all of the messiness with that right to shelter that we heard about earlier. So that was a lot. I'm going to pause so everybody else can get a word in edgewise.
Thanks, Commissioner. If we can just stay on this topic for a moment, we'd love to sort of ask the panel to weigh in. Jack, maybe you can start both of these questions, both on the question of the city's need for innovation and flexibility in response to this crisis, but also your perspective on how affordable housing and the need to develop affordable housing, how that interacts with the current challenge.
Sure, thank you, and thank you all. You know, I want to start with a permanent housing because we always try to start with permanent housing and permanent affordable housing. That's always the mission. All of the work that we do is focused in the end on the goal of getting people into stable permanent housing. And you know, I think the person in New York City who I know who has the greatest expertise and experience on these questions is Commissioner Park, and so I appreciate and endorse everything she said about that. you know, the counterweight of the right to shelter, we always presumed meant that it was obvious that it was a much better outcome, both financially and in terms of what people actually need to get them into permanent housing. So to have that as a motivator in whatever along whatever lines you know, best applies, you know, certainly the goal is always for people to end up in permanent housing. And of course, the population that we're talking about today, it's a much more complicated and difficult question now. If the system has always been designed around the goal of getting people into permanent housing, and as the commissioner said, you know, the people who have been added to the system over the last year and a half, you know, it's a much more complicated and murky picture as to how we might achieve that for this group of people. So it makes perfect sense that the system should respond to that in a different way. And, you know, the court orders and the rest of the right, you know, the right to shelter, I've learned people have very different ideas about what they're talking about when they say that phrase. There are the court orders at the bottom of it, but there are state regulations, there are local laws passed by the city council, there's federal law around disabilities and access for youth to certain kinds of shelters. All of that backdrop does not exist in a vacuum. So, for instance, after Sandy, when the city was confronted with thousands of people who suddenly were homeless, were not, you know, I've heard that people have been using the phrase traditional clients of the Department of Homeless Services. The city responded to that immediately by setting up congregate shelters in high school gyms. Those sites were not Callahan compliant. And in fact, you know, the rules that we have around how shelters are to be operated are there for a reason. And putting families with children in congregate settings is not a good outcome. And in fact, there were people who were harmed as a result of being in those high school gyms right after Sandy. But there was no other alternative at that time. We did not go to court and say these shelters are not compliant with the right to shelter rules. You know, the city responded to an emergency through its Office of Emergency Management. And our view had been, when the current crisis began, that was that a similar approach was warranted, that we should discuss. Certainly we wanted to be consulted as to what the city's plans were, but the city has the flexibility to respond to emergencies, to situations where suddenly there are many more people than had been planned for, had been expected, who have different needs than the traditional shelter system has been designed to serve. You know, there are ways around that. And so it was our view that the appropriate way to deal with the situation was to just continue to work on whatever, you know, we were meeting almost weekly at the beginning, but to try to work out these issues together and come up with a flexible, appropriate response that would meet everyone's needs and ensure that the city could meet its legal obligations to New Yorkers, wherever they came from and however long they'd been here. And we had a very productive, I think, year or so of working that out. We're trying to resolve those issues. And then for whatever reason, it was the administration who chose to go to court and say, we would like to modify the Callahan consent decree. And that led to the current process that we're in, which is a mediation process with the court, which I think has been very productive. But, you know, the question of taking on the sort of bigger philosophical legal questions, what does Callahan mean? What are the city's constitutional obligations? We never thought that was necessary to do in order to solve the current problems. We were focused on addressing the needs of the clients. And, you know, the agencies, particularly the Department of Homeless Services, deserve, you know, tremendous credit for identifying so many placements, for getting people into beds, for, you know, rapidly, almost unimaginably quickly expanding the shelter system. And that's a tremendous, tremendous accomplishment. But I do have to say that the mayor has, and we appreciate the commissioner's commitment to continuing to make sure that people are off the streets. But the mayor's request to the court, which is still pending, is to give the city the authority to deny shelter to most New Yorkers, including low-wage workers, people who are receiving federal disability benefits, people who have been here for decades, have no experience of any other place, but do not have status, are undocumented. All those people would be ineligible if the city's request to the court were granted. Now, again, we are in a mediation process. We are hopeful that this will be resolved, and we are focused on serving everybody. But I think we've highlighted today why it is so important. I mean, even the mayor was waving around the other day photos of Los Angeles and saying New York doesn't look like this. Well, there's a reason, and Professor Hopper told us what that reason was.
Thank you, Josh. I feel like I'm in a deposition now all of a sudden.
I know. Let me bail you out here. You ready?
Yeah,
I'm going to get us out of the courtroom and back into the community. You know, it's so interesting. I have this, the privilege now of working with mayors across the world. And the most frequent thing that the mayors will ask for my support on is advice on homeless services. So I have gotten into the nitty-gritty of a number of cities, Athens, Paris, London, Nashville, San Francisco, Houston, and just seeing the very different circumstances dealing with a very common problem, which is the challenge of the lack of affordable housing and individuals who are desperate with no other options and find themselves on the street. And often find themselves in very good hands in sheltering systems and rehousing systems that are supporting them. And so my first wish in life is that I had that experience before I became homeless commissioner, because then it would have made me feel as proud as I feel of New York City. And I just really want to recognize it's so nice to be in this room with leaders of organizations that are serving people each and every day with dignity and great humanity and and going to bed exhausted because they won't give up until they see each person served reach the kind of fulfillment that they need around stable housing, stable employment, good education for their kids. And I just really want to say to everyone in this room that there is no other system in the world that I have seen that is as good as New York City's. So thank you. It's really true. You know, the next thing I would say is that I agree with Dr. Hopper and with Josh. What's your title? Director, leader, CEO?
Annoying.
Annoying. I didn't mean to be disrespectful by not speaking. But you know, we are the way we are because of the right to shelter, and we are the way we are despite the court-supervised right to shelter. And so I don't think we would be the greatest in the world. We could very well be Los Angeles or San Francisco, which are just embarrassment is such the wrong word to use. But it's just, we could very well be those cities were it not for the right to shelter. And in this, having run, when I was at Homeless Services for a period of 4 years, the number of hoops and creative twists, and maybe we can do this and maybe we can do that, in order to respond to ever emerging and changing needs, is the system as it is now being regulated is just too inflexible. It doesn't make sense. It's not a way to run a service. And so what I would prefer to see, I'm going to get us out of the courtroom, but what I would prefer to see is a right to shelter that doesn't have the same rigidity and where the important issues around design and delivery are not litigated in a court and through lawyers who won't allow commissioners to say things, but in a way that you can actually make good public policy. And I believe that New York City is a place, you know, so it's interesting in a way. I think that there should be a legislative right to shelter with the authority to the department to define the size and shape and parameter of that and the delivery of that to meet the emerging needs. So that, you know, so I think that there's both honor of that history that we have that has been embraced, and I think it is just in the bloodstream of New York City that there will be no reversal of the right to shelter. Like if the court was not there, I believe that we would live up to that because that is who we are. And I think that we would be doing a better job and be more flexible and quick in our responses if we didn't have the same constraints as we're having. So what's really interesting about the situation today, and this is really remarkable, the issues of migration and how it is impacting the challenge of homelessness is a global issue. Whether it's climate disruption or war and risk of bodily harm from the regimes that are oppressing populations in horrific ways, to economic migration. The migration is happening globally. It's the surge that we're feeling in New York City has been a surge that other cities have gone through. I was working in Athens when all of the Syrian refugees were decanting off of Lesbos through the city of Athens. And the response of the city was really remarkable, but it killed them. It was a brutal period, and they were undergoing huge economic challenges to begin with. Paris, France, on the northern border, the Afghani and northern African migrants were gathering on in that area around the northern border, the northern entrance to the city, in the tens of thousands encampment. And again, the mayor had to respond and meet that need, while the national government and the international community, quite frankly, was doing nothing. And so what's really interesting about this is that mayors are dealing with this issue in ways that they never really have had to before, and they don't have the language for dealing with it. They don't have a seat at the table. I can't wait till I just got so I know who I'm passing it to very quickly. They don't have a seat at the table. They're not well versed in immigration and asylee policy and refugee status, and they've never been asked to be at the table, and they've never been funded or structured to deal with these issues. And so they're oftentimes getting slammed with these huge surges and suddenly having to find out, how do I find a place for my city to build a response that is dealing with this issue, the pressure it is putting on the city as a whole, and it's pretty remarkable. They're not doing what a lot of governors do, which is let's build a wall, let's make it as hard as possible. Mayors are dealing with the humanity that mayors do in meeting the needs of the people who are in their city, for those individual needs and for the overall well-being of the city. And there's a really interesting emerging conversation that's happening about what the right urban policy is around migration and refugee status, that is being discovered in these moments when you have to have an answer, and it can't just be like, let's deal with this today. You know it's going to stay with you. So I think it's an emerging issue that I think is pretty fascinating. What do you think about that, Achilles? No, I'm sorry.
No, you got it. You got it. Well, I would just say, and I want to sort of get back to the legal question again. I know I tried to pull us out of the consent decree, but I would love to ask you sort of your historical perspective. Obviously, this is not the first time that New York City has experienced a wave of intense immigration. And how do you think about this moment in the context of those prior moments? How do you think about what's happening here in the context of what's happening in Paris and Athens and around the world? And I guess pre-Callahan, how did the city respond to a crisis like this, and what's different now?
Excellent. Thank you, Rick, and thank you, Linda. I'm going to try and respond to your question, and thanks to all the organizers of Upstream for inviting me to speak about, I think, this very important issue. I realize from the tags that a lot of people are coming from the world of housing and homelessness, right? And I'm probably a minority here speaking about migration, but I think this is a central theme that we need to be talking about right now. So, you know, I'm an immigrant New Yorker, first generation immigrant New Yorker, and at the new school, one of the courses I'm teaching is called Immigrant New York. I think they gave it to me because I'm an immigrant New Yorker. And you know, where I find hope in those, you know, dark moments and days and moments of anxiety is in the history of the city. And I think, starting with Rick's question, what is different? You mentioned Athens, Paris. I think what is different in New York is that New York is a city of immigrants, right? I'm saying this because it's very different from cities with immigrants, which is the case of Athens, which is the case of Paris, right? So if we go back to the history of New York City, we're going to see that the surges in population that we see today have been happening all throughout its history, right? If you would have a graph, there's no PowerPoint to show you the graph that I have in my mind, but if you would look at the influx of migrant populations in the past, you would not see a straight line growing or falling down. You would see a sort of peaks and valleys, right? These peaks and valleys were fashioned both by national immigration policy, quotas for specific countries, reforms that happened later on. They have been formed by geopolitics, right? Migration is a process that is extremely costly, and this is something to remember. It's very difficult for people to make it to New York City or to the United States, right? So because it's very costly, you don't see, or we see migration from very specific places. There's something called the migration hump, which means that the propensity to migrate is higher at certain moments in the development of a country, right? That's the reason why we don't see a lot of migration from, let's say, Germany, right? There's no real incentive for Germans to migrate to the United States, but there are real incentives for people from Central America, from people from Latin America, increasingly from African and sub-Saharan African countries, right? We are also at a moment that is very relevant because if you would look historically, the share of immigrants in the United States, we are arriving at the same peak that we were 100 years ago, right? So this moment is not unprecedented. Actually, in the early 1900s, New York City has seen higher surges, right? Including, you know, people who were displaced or had to move from their place because of fear of persecution. I'm talking about the Jewish population of New York City, right? I'm talking about my fellow Greeks or my ancestor Greeks who had to come here. I'm talking about the Irish. I'm talking about, so the main point that I want to make here is that this is not new for New York. It's new for us, but it's clearly not new for New York, right? What is different today? A lot of the groups that are coming are new. It wasn't different in the past. When the first Greeks arrived here, they didn't know how to navigate the system. They didn't have fellow Greeks. When I arrived here in New York, they told me, oh, go work in a diner, right? So we had already established an industry that was kind of ours in a sense, right? And someone could tell me, oh, if you're Greek, you need to go there. So I think what is really important to understand is that we need to really go back and think, what is our incentives in terms of New York City for these newcomers, right? Do we want to continue to be the New York that we have been, right? And being welcoming. And let me say something here. If you look back in the history, none of the groups that I mentioned before were welcomed with open arms, right? Irish, no need to apply for this job. Jews, no need to apply. Greeks, no need to apply. Italians, no need to apply. Everyone was received with strong skepticism, and there was moments of xenophobia that are present in the history. One of my favorite quotes from the history books is one of the early governors of New York City saying that Italians, and I'm 1/4 Italian, so I can say this, Italians are as aggressive as the Lenape people, the people who initially were living in the Manhattan Island, right? So this sort of prejudice has been present throughout the time. What has been different in many ways is that the time of immigration coincided with very strong reactions and innovations from the part of the government, right? I'm not talking about, Linda said, what is good urban policy for migrants. So good urban policy is good migrant policy, right? We talk a lot about housing, about the question of housing, right? A lot of these people who are coming here, they don't want to stay in the shelter system, right? Again, think of migration as, in many ways, a sacrifice, a generational sacrifice that a lot of these people are doing, in the sense of coming here, knowing very well that it's going to be extremely difficult, right? But coming here with the idea that the next generation is going to be able to do better, right? So if we think of it from this perspective, then we need to question, okay, what is our end goal? What is our objective? Is our objective in, to be very frank, in a moment where there's no immigration policy actually right now, everything we talk about is border control. This is not about immigration. This is not what the sort of immigration policy has been from the federal government, right? So are we willing, or do we want to really integrate in the economy? I'm not talking about integration, which is a very loaded term culturally, et cetera, but integrate those newcomers into the city's economy. They have been doing it on their own. If you go to the shelters and the hotels, you're going to see bikes, a lot of bikes outside, right? Because a lot of these people are finding work as deliveristas, right? As food delivery. So, to me, the main question is, what is our objective as the city's administration, right? Where are the areas, and I think there's many areas that we can innovate, right? And where are the areas that we need to be much, much more, I think, bold in terms of thinking? We are sitting here in Manhattan. At some point, the commissioner's plan decided to increase the land where New York City was by tremendous amounts, right? In the 1900s, you had the incorporation of the boroughs, right? So you had very bold moves that New York City did historically in order to address population pressures, right? So I think we need to start thinking in that sense, thinking bold, not trying to deal with a migration crisis by using the homeless shelter system only, and thinking about how do we move from emergency response, right? It's been 2 years now, right? Emergency response to sustainable responses, right? Do we have the policies? Are there vouchers? How do we also think about a lot of the issues that concerns us as New Yorkers? Because to me, a lot of the times what we call the migration crisis, I think the right term is migration governance crisis, right? What is happening right now. A lot of the times when we think about this, it feels to me almost like a mirror to show all the issues in New York. What is happening with housing? It's unaffordable not for migrants, it's unaffordable for New Yorkers, right? So how can we work with this? How can we work with transportation? So I'm going to stop here. Thank you.
Well, I want to jump in because I'm thinking as you're giving that context, which is so helpful. I'm also thinking about the few experiences that I have had, the stress that the cities were going under was the result of failed migration policies, and I don't think, and it's. There's the pressures that are creating mass movements of individuals are emanating from all different places, but what they're coming up against walls on migration policy that is creating really irrational results and inhumane conditions. And I do believe that migration is now more urban rather than dispersed, and so cities are seeing a greater share of the migration that's happening, and it's kind of coming in these irrational spurts that are just overwhelming cities, and I think that so that would be one thing, which is that we can't predict right now like what city is going to get slammed next in what way, and this is just going to show up, and there's no time to prepare. No one's going to give you advance warning this is going to happen. At the same time, I do think that having a longer-term view of migration from an urban perspective is a wise thing, so that so that if there was a framework where mayors were assisted to think about how this is, how and when and if it appears, here are the, sort of some guideposts that can help you to do a good job, and that can recognize that the net benefit of migrants to your community is one to be embraced, and that if you work in that point of view, then everybody will benefit.
Yeah, please.
I think something else that has changed a lot is the role and expectation for government in working with migrants and working with asylum seekers. There was a piece in the Times, I don't know, a couple months ago, time has lost a little bit of meaning, but about a Holocaust refugees perspective on the current crisis. And it was very personal for me. I'm the grandchild of Holocaust refugees who's currently spending an overwhelming amount of time talking about our current asylum. And the article was intended to be very critical of government response and how we are approaching serving the asylum seekers. But what really jumped out at me was, as this individual was talking about his experience, first of all, going from, who met him with cookies, right? Who was greeting him? Who connected him to language skills? Who provided that initial housing? None of it was government, right? It was all, faith-based organizations, community groups, settlement houses. I don't necessarily believe in this day and age and funding structure that we can pull government out of it, but we have certainly gone arguably so far the other direction that we've created other challenges for us. And then the second challenge that having a very government-driven response creates is that it does away with a lot of ability to support informal housing and informal employment, right? For anybody who's ever been to the Tenement Museum, right, there's pluses and minuses certainly to that housing, right? But people lived in challenging circumstances, but they had a place to live, right? And we certainly know that many migrants, many asylum seekers are living in a variety of informal housing arrangements now. Some of that is unsafe and not appropriate. Some of it is, in fact, a viable way to adapt for a first-generation adaptation to a new place. But we as government, it is very difficult for us to engage with anything that is informal and not, it is, according to the Housing Maintenance Code, it is illegal to have more than 3 unrelated people in an apartment, right? So I can't do that. I can't engage with it, and that creates difficulty.
I just want to highlight 2 points that this conversation brought out. One is that the migration traditionally is something that has been dealt with by the federal and the state government, and this is a migration issue, and the federal and the state government need to step up here and not leave New York City holding the bag. I mean, I think that's obvious, but these are points we want to keep in our mind. And the second point that I always try to make when I have a microphone, and Professor Kallergis has highlighted, is that if you are using a delivery app, the person who is bringing your food is a new arrival in New York City. They are probably renting that account. So please tip them in cash, because that may be the only money they see that day.
Thank you for that reminder too. So I think I want to come back to where we started, and I think what you just said, Commissioner Park, about the strictures of law, good strictures of law, how those sort of prevent some informal arrangements that might be necessary in a moment like this. So to bring it back to the earlier part of the conversation, and just this tension that exists between the role and the need for government flexibility and legal oversight. And I was trained as a civil rights lawyer, and I practiced about 8 months, so it wasn't really much of a career as a lawyer, but for 8 months I was a civil rights lawyer. But as a civil rights lawyer, one of the things that I was trained to revere is the potential role of government oversight. There is a reason why we have consent decrees. We have consent decrees because government does not always respond appropriately, effectively, legally, and it's and I also remember during my 4 years, a little bit longer than a civil rights lawyer, my 4 years in city government, how I reacted as someone who was trying to do the right thing to where I felt that there were legal constraints that were making it difficult to do what is right. And I think in some ways part of the challenge here is that I look about the people who are leading this work. I mean, I'm looking at that table over here. The people who are driving the work right now are people who I trust so implicitly, and yet these people will not always be in charge of city government. And so I guess I would just sort of ask you all to reflect on that. If you think about Callahan, if you think about this tension, do you have any further thoughts on how we balance these competing challenges, and whether it leads any of you to think differently about how Callahan should be structured?
All right, I'll get started. It's just to repeat, it's because of and despite the oversight, the court oversight. I think that the negative outcomes of having the type of consent decree that we have in Callahan is that it puts the organizations who should be working together and fighting together the hardest, the people who are the most devoted and dedicated to the needs of people who are homeless, at odds with each other. And it creates an environment where to win in court, you have to you have to say all the worst things you can possibly think about of your opponent, the government agency that's running the service. You have to undermine their credibility, their authority, and quite, as the commissioner, it was debilitating. I'll tell you, it was so hard to be a leader and keep the staff motivated and driven and feeling appreciated, and have the providers feeling that their jobs were, worthy of getting up for and going to bed exhausted. It was debilitating and you can't help but to internalize the blame that comes. And so it creates a very painful process when those two organizations should be the ones that are working together the closest and being the best of colleagues on that. And so there's a huge price that comes with the kind of consent decree that we have in Callahan, and it doesn't have to be like that. There can be better, there can be a legal right to shelter, even let's say it's not legislated, it is court-based, that does not have that same type of litigious environment that is constantly undermining the very people you want to see succeed.
Thank you. Anybody else want to weigh in? I know this is difficult.
As the government side of the room is clapping.
I won't force anyone to weigh into the other one, but open it up.
I'll just say we don't disagree. I mean, that we have the unique. I mean, Callahan is a unique legal document, but it creates a partnership in that the Coalition for the Homeless has appointed the shelter monitor, and so we are, the Coalition for Better or Worse is a partner with government, and I think the coalition tries to be a good partner, and we have long-standing relationships with people, and we try to work collaboratively and cooperatively, and I think there is a certain amount of mutual respect and understanding that everybody wants the same thing in the end for the clients. And then, unfortunately, there are times when outside actors, let's say, or higher levels of government, or whatever causes it, pushes people into places where there has to be a dispute, and unfortunately, the system that we have for resolving disputes is a legal system. On the other hand, we do have, as we currently have, judges are always very interested in resolving cases and not having them be litigated. And we have happen to have a judge now who has a lot of experience and I think has been extremely helpful. I'll just say, without telling any tales out of school, his approach was, everybody tell me, what's your bottom line? What do you really need? And then he kind of wrote all those things down, and he said, there's your agreement. Now just fill in the details, And I think that's a productive way for us to proceed.
Yeah. So maybe, I know we're running short on time. We were challenged earlier by Anne to focus on hope. And in some ways, everybody here on this panel kind of started in the same place, that the goal here is around what is in the long-term best interests of the city and of these migrants, and sort of recognizing that it's all the same thing. It's about housing, it's about jobs. So maybe just if you could also just share, if we start ahead 2, 3, 4, 5 years, what do you envision? What are the systems that you'd want to build? How do we get to a place where we're not responding to a crisis, but we're building a better and permanent future for the people who are here and the people who are coming?
All right, I'll start. So I'm going to start off being wildly optimistic and say that I really hope that this crisis that is affecting not just New York City, but so many other cities actually becomes a catalyst for true immigration reform. I realize that I'm very glass half full here, but I think there is more potential now than there has been in a long time. That doesn't make it likely, but I'm going to be optimistic. I think if we can change what's happening at the border, right? And that does, just to be clear, I'm not saying that doesn't mean people don't come in, right? But that what does it mean to have a sponsor looks different than it has right now. How do we go from you're coming over the border to where in the United States does it go? So is it really New York, Chicago, Denver, or is there a true plan to decant people across the country that is led by the federal government, right? Is there, what does the pathway to work look like, right? If we can really change some of that so that the front door changes, that will give us the opportunity to really work on that sort of immigration casework plan that I talked about, that, recognizing that for the 69,000 people, asylum seekers who are currently in our care, that this is an immigration issue, that we focus on it as an immigration issue. And a lot of those people are going to be successful in that kind of economic and housing integration that was talked about earlier. And then there's going to be some number of people who aren't, and I think actually that is an important part of that we all need to acknowledge. People who are undocumented immigrants have historically been very long-term stayers in the DHS shelter system. While we are talking about the current population as asylum seekers and which gives them some form of rights. Everything I know about immigration law I've learned in the last 2 years, but it is different to be an undocumented immigrant than it is to be an asylum seeker. We do need to recognize and plan for the fact, though, that we are going to end up with a probably non-trivial number of undocumented immigrants who are going to need long-term assistance from the city. So I think that needs to be part of our planning as well.
Sure. Yeah, so I don't have too much hope. I'm sorry, but I'm a grumpy person by nature, right? So, but I want to say a few things that I think are very important. I think, as I said earlier, we're in a critical moment to decide what we want to do. What worries me more than the asylum seekers is that New York City is losing population. From any urbanist that you talk to, this is a very bad sign for cities. Losing population means that you can retain people who like to be there, or that people select other cities that they prefer to be, right? So for the city, I would think a measure of success is how many of these asylum seekers manage to stay in the city in permanent housing. The reason why I'm saying this is that one easy way to think in an abstract way about cities is that cities are labor markets. The larger the labor market, the richer the city, the more diverse the city, the more interesting the city, and more attractive the city to newcomers, right? So we need to get back into a sort of how do we grow as a city agenda. I know it's very difficult. The politics around housing are extremely complicated, but this would be one thing, right? So set our objectives straight and say that success for New York City is to manage to integrate economically those who are coming in, those asylum seekers. Secondly, I'm not very hopeful, particularly from the national immigration standpoint, so I'm a little bit cautious to imagine that we're going to see any serious reform or any serious openness in that sense. But I'm very hopeful about cities, and I think cities can innovate here, right? There's a series of innovation. Commissioner Park mentioned earlier that New York City is not, or the housing department is not very good dealing with the informal sector, right? There's a lot of informality in New York City housing, right? There's what we call the illegal threes in the Queens. You have more than 3 people living there, right? So it is important to say, how do we become better at addressing these issues? How do we talk to the question of informality that both in terms of housing, but also in terms of labor, right? And what it means and how we create a system that is more just and humane for everyone. And thirdly, I think it's very important to think about city-to-city innovations, right? If there's no strong resettlement program from the federal government, can cities speak to each other, right? Do cities speak to each other? And I know a lot of cities are doing that already, but can we mainstream this sort of talks? And finally, my final point, which really makes me hopeful, is that New York City has a really strong social infrastructure of mutual aid organizations, of religious organizations, of organizations working with specific communities, of organizations working in cross-sectional themes around people of color and migrant, around questions of wage theft, around questions of labor rights. Migrants, unlike what we hear erroneously often, have been really important in creating those rights here in the city. They have been behind some of the most important changes in legislation and in actual practice in terms of labor, in terms of housing as well, right? So we need to hear these voices. I know that the city is talking, but we can do much, much better to bring in these voices here and be able to, I think, really take opportunity of what we have. Again, going back to the history of the city, we have experienced this, and we know that we can do it, and we have done it, right? The question is, do we have the will? Do we have the you know, we do get very tired at home, and and we do work a lot, but can we really push a step further to make sure that we are the place and we respond to what New York City has been throughout its history, a city of migrants?
This is an upside down hope. I think that the housing affordability crisis has become so bad that I am hopeful it's going to create a movement for successful expansion of benefits, and I think particularly I would like to see that in the form of Section 8 being an entitlement. And I just think that people are going to get backed in a corner. You know, it used to be that the homelessness problem, some creative, caring people could like figure out solutions. Could you imagine if the number was 750, Ann? Yeah, I got that. I'll get it done tomorrow, right? It's like it's grown in proportions beyond belief. And I guess my hope is that the crisis is such that people have to wake up and deal with the affordable housing crisis.
Thank you. And then we're going to open up the questions and answers in a minute. But
Just quickly, I would say we were one vote from Section 8 being an entitlement, and that vote was Joe Manchin, so there is hope. I would just say that we would ask that everybody look at this as an opportunity. You know, we have, and not just talking about the city, but the state and at the federal level, that, you know, we have labor shortages, we have declining school enrollments, we have, as you heard, communities that need people, that we have, on the other hand, we have a group of people who are desperate to work, who will start small businesses, who will revitalize economies. And let's look at this moment as a chance to direct that energy into improving our communities and making them stronger.
thank you, Josh. Thank you. Any questions from the... And please introduce yourself. It's coming, it's coming.
We have time for two.
Okay.
Unless you all want to stay here all day.
Hello. Good morning. My name is Hando Martinez. I'm with VNS Health, and we focus on insurance for people who experience homelessness, living with HIV, and identify as transgender. My question is, even before the influx of asylum seekers and foreign-borns, there was challenging issues around vouchers, right, the city FEPs. Are there any new initiatives, and I know you mentioned, Commissioner Park, about they're accepted throughout the state now, but I want to say historically, even before the COVID pandemic and the influx, there's been challenges with landlords accepting city FEPs. Is there any initiatives, any actionable items that you are putting in place or other bodies putting in place to address those issues?
Yeah, great question. So CityFEPS is an incredibly important tool. We have about 39,000 households receiving CityFEPS. That's only one of our city rent subsidies. We're not a housing agency, but we administer rental assistance for 56,000 households, which actually makes us the 4th largest housing authority in the country. So I do like to just level set with that. We've made a lot of changes to CityFEPS from an administrative perspective, right? So I mentioned you can use it statewide now. We've eliminated the 90-day waiting period for being in shelter. We've reduced for families with children. At the start of this administration, you had to be working 30 hours a week. It's now 10. We've made a ton of administrative, very process-oriented changes, and we're continuing to work on that. At the end of the day, rental subsidy is a necessary part of getting out of shelter, of stabilizing, but it's not sufficient because you have to have a place to use the voucher. And in a city like New York, where there is such scarce housing supply, that is always going to be a challenge. And sometimes that is a straight up source of income discrimination piece of it. And we do work very closely with our colleagues who follow up on those cases. But the fact that affordable housing is so scarce, when there's 15 applicants for any unit, it's very difficult to be able to say this is source of income discrimination versus I didn't get the my client didn't get the apartment just because there's so many people competing for the same housing stock. So I think it's incredibly important that we're working with our colleagues at the housing agency, HPD and HCR. I want to shout out to Ruth Ann Wisnauskas, who was here, to continue to develop additional housing, to think about ways that we can convert housing that is not capital A affordable housing to affordable housing, a project that closed last month, and this was a collaboration of HPD, HDC, HCR, and DSS, right? It took the whole village, but converting the JFK Hilton to affordable housing, it's gonna be a minute before the construction happens, but I'm really excited about that. So rental subsidies are important, but we gotta think about supply too.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Steffi, and I represent Restore NYC, an anti-trafficking organization. And what are the conversations being had at the city level to really mitigate individuals that are migrants that could be more vulnerable to human trafficking, labor exploitation, as well as gender-based violence? Because these are really big things that we're seeing in the field right now. And so I'd just love to get your thoughts on that.
I guess that's headed to me too. I'm sorry to hog the mic. So I think it's a really challenging issue, absolutely. I think the fact that we are at this point taking what I keep referring to as a whole of government response to the asylum brings a lot of tools to the table. So certainly within DHS, DSS, we have, some basic level of understanding and ability to screen for risk signs. So for example, every family that is coming in, we are screening for various forms of violence. But we are also working really closely with the Health and Hospitals Corporation that has programs that are specifically for people who have experienced trafficking. We're working really closely with the Mayor's Office to end gender and domestic and gender-based violence, right? So by bringing the expertise of all of the different parties to the table and really trying to break down those silos, it makes us stronger than we ever could be individually. Is there more to do? There's always more to do.
Please join me in thanking this panel for incredible conversation.
Me too.
Thank you, Rich.
Thank you.